Good evening, all. My name is Doru Costache. I am an associate professor in patristic studies at the Sydney College of Divinity, SCD, Australia, lecturing at St. Cyril's Coptic Orthodox Theological College since 2017. St. Cyril's is a member institution of the Sydney College of Divinity. I also am ISCAST Research Director since 2021, the acronym standing for the Institute for the Study of Christianity in the Age of Science and Technology. I mention these affiliations given their relevance for my present talk, exploring the world of the early Christians, Methodological Prolegomena. The same goes for my current undertakings as co-chair of the cosmology group Project Science and Orthodoxy Around the World, that runs the National Hellenic Research Foundation's Institute of Historical Research, Athens 2020 to 2023, and as the inaugural Selby All Fellow in Religious History of the Orthodox Christian Faith at the University of Sydney's Fisher Library 2021-2022. I begin by expressing my gratitude for Patricia Thinner's invitation. I'm also thankful for this opportunity to introduce my recent book, Humankind and the Cosmos, Early Christian Representations, Brill 2021. But before I turn to the topic of the monograph and the approach taken therein, I shall briefly refer to my research background. Many years ago, as a doctoral candidate in Orthodox theology at the University of Bucharest, Romania, I noticed that not much work was being done towards grasping the world of the early Christians, that is, the way they represented the world, from the Earth's environment to the cosmos at large, while a great many studies focused on the early Christian world, taken as the whole array of human expressions pertaining to social and artificial environments. It did not take me long to realize that what prompted researchers to focus almost without exception upon the social, psychological, cultural, and artistic aspects of the early Christian phenomenon was more than anthropocentrism. It is this frame of mind that, said otherwise, conditioned their lack of enthusiasm for how the early Christians represented and experienced the natural world. We shall see a little later that what has generated this ongoing situation are more complex factors. As I have come to understand in time, several other causes have been and are at play. Indeed, the above were my initial discoveries. What matters for now is my realization that contemporary research overall disregards the natural background of early Christians' life, the world. I still work with this assumption. Whatever has occurred in the meantime did not alter my perception much. Acting upon this realization, in most of my work since the mid-1990s, I have addressed patristic representations of reality or cosmology, including natural contemplation, where many of the relevant topics and the approaches I have experimented with creatively intersect. But before I turn to that, a brief survey of my early research is in order. My first journal article on related matters, published in 1995, was in Romanian and explored the cosmological thinking of Athanasius of Alexandria in Against the Gentiles and on the Incarnation. I might say that I have slightly looked at these works through the lens of my then very important interests in environmental theology, eco-theology, stuff like that. This article laid the foundations for my doctoral research begun that very year, which focused on the Anthropic Cosmological principle, assessed from the vantage point of a Byzantine theologian, Maximus the Confessor, and the modern Orthodox theologian, Dumitru Stăniloae, a representative of the neo-patristic movement. As my doctoral research progressed, and for several years after my graduation in 2000, I continue to publish journal articles and book chapters on these authors and related topics, from patristic cosmology to environmental theology to the history of science and religion within the patristic tradition. I must acknowledge here the tremendous encouragement I received during those years from my first mentor and doctoral supervisor, Dumitru Popescu, a systematic theologian with an interest in theology and culture, whose assistant lecturer I was until my relocation to Sydney in 2004. It is under his guidance that I learned to work across various disciplines, which represents the staple of my research to date. His schooling served me well. Beginning in the early 2000s, I have become involved in successive interdisciplinary projects in science and religion, pioneering this field in Romania alongside two great mentors and friends, Basarab Nicolescu, the physicist and philosopher, father of the worldwide transdisciplinary movement, and Magda Stavinsky, an astronomer who for several decades has tirelessly worked towards bridging Orthodox Christianity and the scientific culture of our age. It is to them, actually, that I dedicate this paper with utmost gratitude. Through all those years of intense work across several disciplines, my contributions have consistently taken patristic research as a vantage point. These efforts were instrumental towards perfecting the method I have toyed with in the last several years and which I followed in my recent monograph. Throughout the previous decade, my work on early Christian cosmology continued with studies of Clement of Alexandria, Athanasius, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory the Theologian of Constantinople, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus, and Gregory Palamas. Given my work setting as the SCD's primary patristic scholar, I experimented with more patristically rigorous approaches, including historical, reception, and literary elements. I have also diversified my interests, publishing in areas such as well-being, spirituality, gender, epistemology, and dreams and visions, for all of which maintaining patristic studies as my intellectual backdrop. The most significant outcome of these later efforts is the volume Dreams, Virtue, and Divine Knowledge in Early Christian Egypt, Cambridge University Press, 2019. A volume I co-authored with Bronwen Neal and a younger researcher, Kevin Wagner. My main contribution there on Athanasius and the Desert Tradition straddles a number of disciplines from history to comparative literature to religious studies to cognitive science to ascetic spirituality. Towards the end of that decade, due to my being co-opted by Project SO, Science and Orthodoxy Around the World, for its first phase, 2017-2019, and for its second installment mentioned above, I have returned to science and religion, managing to publish several journal articles and book chapters, most of which taking patristics as methodological framework. I have completed my 2021 monograph during this latter stage of my research, when I had extremely fruitful cooperations with Peter Harrison, Efthymios Nikolaidis, and other Project SO participants. In parallel, since 2017, I have been an honorary associate of the Department of Studies in Religion at the University of Sydney, in which capacity I contributed several undertakings together with Carol Cusack, Ian Gardner, Jane Johnston, and Gary Tromf. This cooperation also resulted in several publications, the approaches of these fine Australian scholars having an important impact upon my research in the last few years. I hope to be able to continue cooperating with them in my new capacity as Selby All Fellow at the library. The impact of all these experiences and cooperations is obvious in the multidisciplinary method I have deployed in Humankind and the Cosmos, the object of my talk, where my goal was to grasp the world both as the early Christians represented it and as a modern researcher might understand that representation. In short, what I have undertaken was to bring early Christian studies, especially patristic cosmology, into conversation with issues in science and theology, an undertaking which, as Andrew Louth pointed out, is far from strange when it comes to taking the patristic tradition in its own terms, that is, free of anthropocentrism. I should actually begin to share my text, because some of you might be interested in getting my sources, the sources that I use. It is at this juncture that I turn to my book, but not before acknowledging the support I have received from the editors of the Brill series supplements to Vigilia Christianae, David Runia and Virat Rauhorst, to whom I am deeply grateful. The idea of this book stems from my discovering how very little we know about the early Christian worldview and what it says about people's place within the universe. Scholars of early Christianity and patristic studies occasionally move beyond the customary ethical, historical, literary, philosophical, spiritual, and theological considerations into the broader spheres of geography, the history of ideas, the history of mentalities, material culture, pedagogy, and sociology. But the interactions between the early Christians and the earth environment remain largely uncharted. So does too the interdependence of their cosmology and their attitudes, ideas, and values. Even when the term worldview makes an appearance, its cosmic and cosmological connotations are lost. Alongside anthropocentrism, the factors that contribute to our relative ignorance have to do with ingrained dichotomies, reductionism, compartmentalization, and over-specialization. These find support in modern binaries such as the dissociation of history and the cosmos, culture and nature, viewer and viewed, or subject and object. It is these assumptions that induce scholars to consider the early Christian experience outside the natural world. In reductionist fashion, most scholarly treatments replace nature by culture and the cosmos by history. This widespread approach does not differ from current talks on economy, notoriously oblivious of environmental concerns. Talks on economy and academic historicism also betray the modern trend towards over-specialization, which deploys reductionism as a touchstone of cultural analysis. And over-specialization, to borrow from Isaac Asimov, one of my favorite authors, cuts knowledge at a million points and leaves it bleeding. No wonder we know so much about the early Christian world, by which we mean a built environment, and so little about the natural world of the early Christians, how they represented God's creation, the earth's environment, humankind's abode. We keep confusing urbs and orbs, or, as Asimov states, the empire and the universe. To distinguish these items is pivotal to my argument. In chapter 7 of the book, I actually talk about ecology and empire against the backdrop of contemporary environmental history. My book demonstrates that early Christians did not primarily construe themselves as inhabitants of built environments, at least not as much as modern people do. As traditional people, they did not live in history only, they lived within a cosmos. They inhabited this earth, this world. Their universe was a divinely created home for human beings made in God's image. All their attitudes to life, culture, and the values derive from this foundational experience, their being in the world. I therefore agree with Francis Young's point that a particular understanding of the world and humanity as God's creatures validates and undergirds the explicit, predominantly ethical teaching. Ethics derives from people's experience in the cosmos and does not exhaust it. In order to understand the attitudes, values, and aspirations of the early Christians, we must discover how they view the world. We must, in other words, understand their cosmology and, as I show throughout Humankind and the Cosmos, their manner of natural contemplation. A merely historicist approach fails to do justice to their experience. So do too any other forms of reductionism. And since reductionist approaches do not support a rounded assessment of this experience, In my book, I draw upon a broad disciplinary pool and a wider range of concepts. To these approaches and concepts I must now turn. My method encompasses three distinct layers. First, given that in this monograph I work with writings of late antiquity, I follow the standard approach in biblical, early Christian, and patristic studies, combining historical, literary, philosophical, and theological tools. Depending on their particulars and my own focus, I discuss these writings and their context, antecedents, authorial aims, genre, literary tropes, and the theological, the philosophical, and the cultural underpinnings of their discourse. I also engage the relevant scholarship, old and new, showing how my approach confirms or diverges from received views. Just briefly, and in regard to the study of patristic cosmology, the authors with whom I find myself in conversation most times throughout the book are Paul Blauers, Charlotte Köckert, Joshua Lollar, Jaroslav Pelikan, and David Sutherland Wallace Hadrill. And you see in the footnotes some of the sources that I have worked on and with. Anyway, only in the light of such preparatory work do I address the early Christian worldview, particularly the matter of dwelling in the world. I exemplify most topics by relevant quotations, which overall I examine thoroughly. Textual analysis consists in explanation, interpretation, or both. It is exegetical as well as hermeneutical. Where needed, I provide keywords and relevant phrases in the classical languages. I must point out that, with few exceptions, all translations from the classical languages are mine. These translations are integral to my argument. Sometimes, indeed, my solutions differ significantly from the existing renditions. As certain existing translations implicitly convey modern assumptions, such as those I listed earlier, the need to replace them is obvious. Second, for the purposes of understanding the passages I analyze, whether cosmological in scope or otherwise, and considering their particulars, throughout the book I adopt methods from a variety of fields. Recently, this approach came to be dubbed the social historical method, which is a deceiving, simplistic perhaps, way of talking about such a complex method. But anyway, accordingly, often I call on apocalyptic studies, studies in asceticism, church history, cultural studies, environmental studies, the history of ideas, the history of music, the history of philosophy, the history of science, the philosophy of science, religious studies, and science and theology, science and religion, if you like. If we are to grasp the complexities pertaining to the early Christian texts, this multifocal lens is sine qua non. This approach is not especially original, since contemporary scholars already draw on the history of the medical sciences and cognitive sciences, for example, to study aspects of the early Christian experience. Original, however, is my deployment of this interdisciplinary lens for the study of the world, including recourse to scientific cosmology. Contemporary cosmology is particularly useful as it helps us to overcome the anthropocentrism and the historicism of the past several centuries, allowing us to see the world with eyes that resemble those of late ancient people. The introduction to each chapter clarifies what disciplinary approaches I apply therein and how. Third, talking about my method, and drawing upon the above, in order to arrive at a comprehensive view of the relevant topics in humankind and the cosmos, I utilize a range of contemporary concepts borrowed from several fields of study, notably anthropic cosmology, big history, environmental history, synergy, and theory of everything. These concepts represent integrative frameworks which consider reality beyond the disciplinary divides. For example, anthropic cosmology, also known as the anthropic principle, bridges the two sciences which continue to walk their separate ways since the dawn of modernity, cosmology and anthropology. This vantage point is wholly at odds with modern historicism and other reductionist assumptions, but matches perfectly the encompassing parameters of the early Christian worldview, especially its cosmic dimension and sensitivity towards the earth. While historicism is patent in the statement, "You are of no use to the stars," as we read in Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, the following scientific account points to the anthropic principle with great clarity. And I'm quoting from Paul Davis. Far from exposing human beings as incidental products of blind physical forces, science suggests that the existence of conscious organisms is a fundamental feature of the universe, who have been written into the laws of nature in a deep and, I believe, meaningful way. I don't know of any patristic authors who would not rejoice at reading such a passage. Throughout my book, Anthropic Cosmology means that human and cosmic realities are mutually inclusive. I especially refer to the anthropic principle when I discuss the early Christians as active factors within the world. Chapters 1 and 7 explore this sense of the concept. The introduction of environmental history as a key concept in my book serves the same goal. It alerts us to the need to consider together the development of civilization and its impact upon the planetary ecosystem. This concept helps me account for the early Christian experience as ecologically anchored, an outcome due to the doctrine of creation. Accordingly, sometimes I compare the early Christian doctrine of creation to current concepts of theory of everything and big history. Both signify the contemporary quest for coherence in the grasping of reality. The theory of everything, an ongoing challenge for hard scientists, seeks an algorithm capable of explaining the whole of cosmic reality together with its parts. What heralds this algorithm is the simplicity and the beauty of scientific theories, which give a sense of how the whole of nature fits together into one grand picture. It's a quotation from a book by two Australian cosmologists, Lewis and Barnes. In turn, big history is a narrative which rewrites humankind's story against the backdrop of cosmic evolution, the genesis of our planet and the emergence of life on Earth. I take both these concepts in a theological sense. I do so in order to hold together in a synoptic view God, humankind, and cosmos, or the cosmos as people's divinely given home. The early Christians believed in the weaving of all things together. As Asimov would have it, they believed that nothing can happen anywhere without affecting everywhere. All this bears upon the principle of synergy, another conceptual mainstay of my book. Synergy, or cooperation, is the way contemporary thought frames the interaction between God, humankind, and the cosmos on all levels of reality. Actually, I have written quite extensively on the principle of synergy, and I'm glad to see that the same interest exists everywhere, or at least in some places. I address this principle in chapters 2, 5, 6, and 7, so it's a central concept to patristic cosmology, at least from my viewpoint. It is concerning that both the theological and the cosmic dimensions, so integral to the early Christian experience, are missing in many scholarly assessments. How accurate, therefore, can these assessments be? It is my conviction that they are not, at least not fully. Hence, the need to look through more comprehensive lenses at this experience. The concepts listed above are instrumental to that end. The same goes for other concepts and approaches I make use of in Humankind and the Cosmos. Nature's big numbers, fine-tuning, chaos theory, the fractal patterns, phenomenology's capacity of bridging the subject and the object, and transdisciplinarity's ternary or inclusive logic. Such concepts help me to capture the early Christian cosmology in all its complexity, free of modern binaries, and to consider humankind together with the Earth ecosystem and the cosmos at large. Another valuable concept I sometimes deploy here is the syntactic space, which articulates the textual nature of the world as received in a certain community. I build on this notion towards discussing the world as another scripture, especially in chapters 3 and 4. These concepts also help me to translate the early Christian wisdom into an idiom intelligible to contemporary audiences towards a wider applicability beyond purely academic interests. Through the interdisciplinary lens of the above concepts and fields, I have seen things differently. As the saying goes among hard scientists, the method conditions the outcomes. Accordingly, humankind and the cosmos embodies both the complex method I followed and its impact upon our grasp of the early Christian worldview. Overall, I emulate Wallace Hadrill and Pelikan's research in natural philosophy, Cokert's analytical approach, Blauer's traditional contextualization, and Lollar's elaborations on the aesthetic grounds of natural contemplation. I do so within the interdisciplinary framework and through the concepts outlined above. Therefore, while in some matters I concur with these authors, of necessity the outcomes of my investigation differ from theirs. The difference increases given that I borrow other elements from the broader disciplinary pool of cultural, early Christian, and religious studies, alongside those from the hard sciences mentioned above. Thus, I discuss apocalyptic motifs, musical metaphors, heuristic pedagogy, the paideia curriculum, philosophy as a way of life, the rise of the holy man, and the threefold spiritual curricula. To see how I have implemented all these tools, you will have to read my book. But given its significance for chapters 3 and 4, let me briefly allude here to one example, the holy man. I borrowed the concept as Peter Brown discussed it. He pointed out the fact that the Christian saint embodied and transformed the ideals of classical paideia. Brown discussed the similarities and the dissimilarities between the ancient and the late antique exemplars of perfection, but what is crucial is that his holy man is an educated saint with an interest in contemplation. I refer this typology to the contributions of Clement and Origen of Alexandria and Evagrius Ponticus. The towering figure of the holy man made a profound impact upon their thinking. Clement delved at length into what he called holy Gnostic, by which he captured the profile of the holy man as possessed of superior education and fully invested in the pursuit of knowledge. No wonder Clement's theory of natural contemplation focuses more upon the successful contemplative, the holy Gnostic, and less on methodological matters. In turn, Origen and Evagrius wrote complex metaphorical narratives, cosmological and eschatological in their outlook, and redolent with apocalyptic tropes. But their interest was also in conveying the experiences of the holy man, a Gnostic and a saint. At least this is how I read their speculations. In my reading, I borrow from Karen Torgerson and Peter Martens's treatment of the holy interpreter as central to patristic exegesis, Bogdan Bucur's view of Clement's ladder of divine ascent as interiorized apocalyptic, and Vlad Niculescu's reconstruction of Origen's thinking as fundamentally hermeneutical. Their contributions further nuance Brown's holy man. I chose to examine this case in detail because of its ramifications for contemporary scholarship, which takes the speculations of Origen and Evagrius at prima facie value, not as hagiological metaphors with serious repercussions for our grasp of the matters at hand. Whoever is interested in this topic will have to read most of chapters 3 and 4 in Humankind and the Cosmos. Well, this book begins by analyzing the relationship between humankind and the world in Letter to Diognetus, in chapter 1, and finishes by considering the impact of an aesthetically transformed humanity upon cosmic order and harmony in Gregory of Nyssa and John Chrysostom, chapter 7. This symmetrical structure reflects the developing interest of the early Christians in articulating a theological worldview that pieces together humanity, the biosphere, the earth, and the cosmos in its entirety. The particularities of the sources and the scope of the remaining chapters fill the gaps in the coherent framework of chapters 1 and 7 by showcasing how the early Christians consider the world itself. Thus, between the metaphorical brackets represented by chapters 1 and 7, the book treats representations of reality by way of ecclesiastical, liturgical, and musical imagery in Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, and Athanasius. That's chapter 2. Contemplatively, in Clement, Origen, Athanasius, and Evagrius, chapters 3 and 4, and through the interdisciplinary lens of scriptural interpretation and the available sciences in Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nyssa, chapters 5 and 6. A wide range of intentions, themes, and approaches is found in these sources. All of them have something important to say about the cosmos and the place Christians or humankind more broadly hold within it. Together with their shared theological assumptions, it is their reference to the world that secures the coherence of these sources within the tradition. And it is their coherence that binds together the chapters of my book. I shall conclude by summarizing one of my findings, what I call one of yesterday's lessons for today. Indeed, what I suggest is that my interdisciplinary approach could lead to more than a better understanding of the past. It could provide us with ideas that are relevant to our immediate needs and purposes. Being disconnected from nature, our civilization of technological might, economical rationale, and leisurely pursuits, the brave new world, has critically wounded the Earth's ecosphere as well as our own lives. And the brave new world is unable to heal either the Earth or ourselves. Yet heal the Earth and our lives it must. But how can the early Christian cosmology be of help in this regard over the gulfs of history? Well, from the 2nd to the 5th century, Christians produced a holistic, detailed, and polychrome picture of the cosmos in which they lived. This comprehensive depiction emerged by considering reality through the lens of Scripture, their ecclesiastical, liturgical, and spiritual experience, sometimes in conversation with other religious traditions, and also through the available sciences, philosophy, art, and literature. Against this broad cultural backdrop, they develop a worldview, a cosmology which considers humankind's own place within the earthly environment and the ordered universe. This worldview is a genuine anthropic cosmology which affirms people's belonging with God's creation and their sense of solidarity with it, for better or worse. The early Christian experience therefore pertains to big history and to environmental history. The narrow disciplinary approaches usually followed by patristic scholars cannot account for its length, width, and depth. Perceived through such a lens as the one I use in Humankind and the Cosmos, Promo, the world is complex, and so are two people's interactions with it. It is in the light of a similarly holistic representation of reality, deciphered through my lens, that the early Christians assess their own activities, tasks, and aspirations. As for us, modern people, while we describe reality better than they did, we lost their aptitude to see through things and to grasp connections. For us, matters of cosmology and anthropology, economy and ecology do not sit well together. On several occasions throughout this book, I have shown that compartmentalization and over-specialization are our main weaknesses, indeed our enemies. These features of our culture prevent us from realizing the issues that confront us and from grasping the early Christian world in its complexity. A change of method is in order, and the stances discussed throughout my book might point us, I hope, in the right direction. At least that's something that I'll be trying to do for as long as I'll be able to work. Thank you.